Welcome to part 3 of this video tutorial where we're looking at making a sculpture of Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones. Now in the previous part of the video we looked at finishing the sculpture and making some casts of some armour pieces. In this final part of the video series we're going to cook up the sculpture, paint everything and make some final additional pieces. So let's get started. Now, as I mentioned in the previous part of the video, I've made the sculpture so it can be taken apart, and this was useful when I was actually sculpting it up because it allowed me to take complicated items like the hand or the head away from the main sculpture and to sculpt them separately, so it just lets you get close to the detail a little bit easier than having to hold the entire sculpture the whole time. Now, it's also useful to be able to take the sculpture apart when you come to cooking it. The reason being is that different parts of the sculpture need slightly different approaches to cooking the sculpey. Now for the main body, that's going to be painted, so it doesn't matter too much if the sculpey discolours or cracks or something like that when it's cooked. Because it's going to be painted, I can fill in any gaps that happen, and if it's discoloured it doesn't matter because the paint's going to hide it. But for the head I want to retain the skin texture. Sculpey has a degree of translucency to it, which I find adds a degree of realism to a sculpture beyond what you can get with paint. So it would be a bit of a disaster if the head were to crack or the sculpey were to discolour in the oven. Because of that I'm going to cook the head for a slightly shorter period of time and at a lower temperature than the manufacturers recommend. They generally say that you should cook it at 130 degrees and for 15 minutes for every, I think, half inch of sculpey. What I'm going to do is cook this at 100 degrees centigrade and just leave it in for about 10 minutes or so. If you leave the sculpey in for the recommended amount of time, it will cook solid and the sculpture will be quite hard, but I tend to find that that causes the sculpey to crack on some occasions, and it also causes the colour to get a little bit darker, which is something I don't want for the flesh coloured pieces of the sculpture. And as you can see here, I'm putting some foil over the head. This is just to stop the heat from the elements overheating certain areas of the sculpture. I'm just trying to get the sculpture to be evenly heated throughout so that there's no differences in temperature which might cause discoloration. So what I'm hoping to get here is the sculpey to a tough enough consistency that it can survive being handled and being painted, but not so hard that it discolours and it cracks. Now this is a bit of a subtle art, so what I find myself doing is opening the oven every so often and just checking the sculpey to see if it's got to a stage where I think it's good to go. Now at this stage the sculpey is hard to the touch. When it's hot, when it's cooked, you will find it goes a little bit spongy. When it cools down it gets a bit harder. At this stage in the process it feels hard to the touch, there's a bit of give in it, but I think it's probably about right. I don't want to cook it anymore because I think if I do it's going to start getting to that stage where it does get a little bit darker when I risk it cracking. So I'm going to take it out of the oven now and let it cool down. Now as I mentioned, for the body I don't need to be quite as careful, so what I'm doing here is just propping the body up on its wooden base, and as you can see I've got a bit of wire going into the armature and the neck just to hold it above the floor of the oven. I've found on occasion that if the sculpey actually touches the base of the oven it can burn quite easily, so I'm trying to avoid it touching the edges of the oven. And as with the head I'm also putting some foil over it. This is just so that the sculpey isn't directly exposed to the elements of the oven. I'm just trying to get an even exposure to the heat so that no one part of the sculpture is heated more than the other. So the body's now cooked and that's actually looking pretty good. I can't see any obvious cracks or discoloration or anything like that. One thing I will say is always set a timer on your phone or on your computer or something like that. I have in the past got distracted and completely forgotten that I had a sculpture in the oven. Come back half an hour later and just found that I've got a smoking lump of charcoal in the oven instead of the sculpture that I took weeks working on. So be careful. This is good, so we can now move on to painting. I'm using a fairly simple approach to painting the body here. As you can see I'm only using a few different shades of brown here, so I've got one shade for the legs, another for the boots and another for the main body. What I found myself doing recently for sculptures is simply to paint things a very simple base coat, but then use washes of oil paints and various inks and things like that to bring out the detail. So that's the approach I'm going to use here. So here you can see I've painted the breastplate red and I've used some metal paints to give the edging strips a brass finish. What I'm now using is some washes from Games Workshop to bring out the highlights. What these are effectively thin, almost ink-like colours that you can use to overlay base coats, and the idea is that it just sort of brings out some of the texture of the model, adds a variation of colour. You can get a similar effect with washes of oil paints which have been thinned down, which I also use quite a lot as well. So now I'm turning my attention to painting the head. And as I mentioned before, I took particular care to make sure the head wasn't damaged or discoloured or anything like that when I cooked the Sculpey. So now I'm at the stage where I'm ready to paint, and I don't want to mess this up. I've really only got one shot at it. If I do get like black paint in the middle of the forehead or something, it might be a bit difficult to remove, and I might even have to go back and re-sculpt the whole thing. Something I don't want to do, so I'm being very careful here. Now Tywin has blonde hair, so I'm starting with that. It's a fairly easy intro to this. So I'm just adding some very light browns and yellows to the hair. And the way I'm doing this is to use oil paints, and I've mentioned in previous videos the reason I do this is because you can thin them down to very thin washes and slowly build a colour up. The advantage of that is you can get some quite subtle variations in colour, but it also means that you don't end up putting really thick layers of paint on, so if you do go wrong it's a little bit easier to correct. And because oil paints take a while to dry, you can still move them around on the surface of the sculpture fairly easily, so if you do make a mistake you can usually correct. So as you can see, I'm slowly building this up here. I'm always surprised about how much only a tiny amount of red will actually add to a sculpture, and really sort of brings it to life the minute you add a little bit of red to the cheeks and around the eyes. Now, as mentioned before, I took some time to sculpt some stubble into the sculpture, and I'm now going in with some brown washes just to try and bring that out as well. And I think once I did that, it really did sort of bring the sculpture to life. You know, it really sort of gave it the look I was after. Now, I think I'm more or less going to leave it there. The paint here is pretty subtle, I would say. I just don't want to overdo it. I don't want it to look too painted. I want it to look natural and realistic. So I think you've got to call it somewhere with this. It's possible to just keep adding paint and eventually go beyond the point where you lose the realism. So I'm going to leave it here, and I think that looks pretty good. I went back and forth over the paint job for the head quite a lot, wondering whether I should add more paint to it or not. However, I came into the front room one day ready to go to work, and just by pure accident the sunlight was streaming through the curtains and landing directly over half of Tywin's face. So I grabbed the camera and took some video and some stills. And I thought it just really looked cool, a really cool shot, and it just goes to show how much lighting can play into how a paint job looks. So I tend to find that this paint job at least looks great in natural light, maybe a bit less good in artificial light. Now, in the scene from the show that I'm using as reference, Tywin arrives with a large red sash thrown over his shoulders, so I need to do something for that. And I didn't even really think about sculpting this at all, so it was always intended to be a fabric. So what I've done is to get some quite thin fabric. The problem with making a scale model is that if you get some regularly sized fabric, it can look too thick and bulky for the model. So I've tried to get something quite thin. What I've done is to put some thin strips of foam inside to give it some form, and then just folded the fabric over that so it looks like it's folded naturally. So I'm really at a stage now where I can start piecing together all the pieces that I've made for this sculpture. So there's the casts of my shoulder pads that I created in the last video, just going on there. You might be able to see that there's some brass detailing on there. In the complete costume, these are actually etched brass sheets which are attached to the armour panels. Now, you can etch brass, and I've been intending to give it a go at some stage, but I think at this scale these pieces are going to be so small that I don't think etching is going to work particularly well. So what I've used here is just some plastic strips that I found in the hobby shop, and they just have some various designs that you can stick on. They're a little bit bigger than you'd probably like, but I think they work well enough. Now that I have the legs painted, I can also look to attach my chainmail pieces and the leather skirt that's going to cover them. So that's just going to fit on like that. Now, something else that Tywin also has is these sections of leg armour that you can see in the photo here. Now, I'd always intended these to be separate pieces away from the main sculpture, but I hadn't entirely decided how I was going to make them. Now, it occurred to me that a lot of people use EVA foam for full-size costumes, and I sort of thought, well, why couldn't that work for smaller scale models too? So what I've done here is to cut up some very thin EVA foam strips and created some armour that way. And it actually worked out pretty well. I found this stuff really easy to use, and once it's all painted up, you really can't tell that it's foam. So things are starting to take shape now, and it's finally beginning to look like the image I had in my head about a month or so ago. That's one thing I find with sculptures, is it takes quite a long time for you to fully realise the original vision you had for it. Now, one thing you can probably see in the video here is a belt that I've actually made out of leather. So what I've done here is just to cut some thin strips of leather out and to bend some wire into a buckle shape. Now, you may have wondered why Tywin's hand has been out in this particular pose. The reason for that is I want him to have his hand resting on the pommel of a sword. I'm not actually sure if I've ever seen Tywin in the show wielding a sword or having a sword on his belt. I think the idea is because he's a general or a commander, he doesn't really do any hand-to-hand fighting, so he's never armed. Nevertheless, I kind of felt like he should have one because he's armoured up, so he's obviously wary of being attacked. So I thought it'd be nice to have a sword in one hand, and in the other hand some rolled up scrolls to sort of signify diplomacy and war as being the two sides of Tywin's personality, I suppose you might say. So the way I'm putting this together is to get some brass tube here. As you can see, I've already wrapped some leather around the handle, and I've got a metal skull. This is actually a bead that I found in a bead shop, so I've just glued all that on. What I now need to do is make a scabbard. So the way I'm going to do that is to take some styrene plastic, glue it to the brass rod, and then bend it into shape. Styrene's quite easy to shape, so I can file it down quite easily and sand it to a smooth finish. I actually ended up ditching those metal leaves you can see I've used there. I guess that's called the crossguard. I just thought they looked a little bit too fantastical for Game of Thrones. I mean, the props there generally tend to go for a much more real world look, so I thought they looked a little bit too high fantasy. And the final element to this is to make a base. Now, I always try and put as much effort into the base as I do for the main sculpture, so I think if the base looks a bit shoddy, it can sort of let down the overall look of the piece. However, I was running out of time a little bit when I came to actually make this, so I've just opted for a fairly simple thing made out of styrene plastic. I've simply overlaid the wooden stand that I was using for the sculpture previously. I've also taken some pieces of EVA foam and just glued them to the base to give a sort of paving slab look to it. So this is what I've come up with. Now, obviously, if you started at part 1 of this video series, you will have already seen this, but it's nice to sort of see how this was all put together. I like the degree of detail that I've managed to work into this, and I think it does bear more than a passing resemblance to Charles Dance, which is quite good. So yeah, that's it for this video series. If you've stuck this far, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.